and go ahead and take it away.
So I had a lot of help from this group, the Eagle Group, 6 or 9 months ago, looking for a job. And actually, this lovely lady, Lacey Hart, found me, and I think I applied to one of her jobs, and then I didn't end up getting it. I didn't hold a grudge though. She offered me a position with her nonprofit called Hope to Healing, and then she eventually gave me the job I was looking for afterwards. But anyways, so what we do, we strive to support law enforcement, first responders, military and veterans, and frontline medical workers, and learning how to cope and understand the stressors that they're going through, and it's normal, and they can self-advocate for themselves, so they don't have to come to a point where they're needing, post-traumatic growth. They can kind of do some pre-traumatic strengthening, per se. And I've had a pleasure working with her, and going through trying to get our word out there, and I'm happy that you guys accepted my request to come speak here. She has a lot of good stuff to say, and I go on about her accolades. She's an MBA administrator at Mayo. Publication stuff. But all great person. I'm happy to be working with her group.
And I'm gonna
You're breaking up for me, Lacey. I'm wondering. You're breaking up. You want to maybe try doing it without video?
Also, if everyone can mute their signal, that can help too, the sound.
All right. Can you hear me now?
Yep, and we can see your screen.
All right. Perfect. So thank you, Jessie. Absolute pleasure getting to know Jessie. I think the biggest thing I will say in working with Jessie is I think working with veterans, but doesn't always know how to take into work. And so we've been having fun learning from each other, and especially for me to learn how I can help support Jessie. Am I still cutting out? Let me just change my internet and see if. Okay, is that better?
Yes.
Okay.
Much.
I just switched my internet, hoping that worked. All right, so first of all, I'm gonna just quick skip ahead. Thank you so much for your time. The biggest thing we believe in our foundation, and with Jessie and our work at Mayo Clinic, is really the most precious thing you have is your time. And so thank you for your gift of your time today. We talk about post-traumatic growth. And really it's a positive spin, right? Especially when you think about things when we've gone through this perfect storm, coronavirus, in our space of healthcare, or in many of these caregiving or community positions, there's a labor shortage. And so it's really a time, instead of having it be overwhelming, but let's rethink and reconsider, what this means. And so of course there's the obvious of a greater appreciation for life, but it also provides some new possibilities. And that's really kind of what we're focused on, is how to look at those new possibilities. Unfortunately, the one thing I'm sad to say is with coronavirus, while a lot of caregiving professions, everything from our healthcare workers, our law enforcement, it, it started out as everyone was a hero, and now everyone's not so much a hero. And so we can't think that as a society, though. Our caregivers are the most precious resource we have. It's what helps us as humans and takes care of us. And so we really need to think of them as precious resources. The other part I'm going to talk to a little bit about, and this is work done at Mayo, is what happens to your body when you're in a caregiving profession. As a veteran, you'd be very familiar with it when you go into danger, as opposed to running from it. But it turns out the brain functions in the same way when you go into compassion, because compassion is something that actually means you go into something your body is telling you to run away from in order to provide care. And so I'll talk a little bit about what that does and why some of the resiliency that you need is different when you're in that for a profession. There's also just a unique component. So while there's a lot in burnout media, in just kind of talking about, everybody is burnt out, but there is a uniqueness to giving compassion. And so if you're in a profession where you're extending compassion as your livelihood, there is a negative cost of that caring. Now, you don't even need to be a profession. Actually, I should clarify, it could be anyone. If you're taking care of, I take care of my mother. So if you're in an ongoing caregiving position, you're at high risk for compassion fatigue. And unfortunately, even though people might know about it, they don't always know the signs, and they don't always, have this awareness of what might be the fatigue and the wearing down of the resiliency. Some of what we help people do, especially in the professions, is just know the signs instead of the words. Really, what are the things that happen? So you might be, for example, if you have sleep disturbance, well, let's look at what that's about. And are you then is compassion fatigue the root of that symptom? And we do this translation for the different professions. So some of the signs in healthcare are different than in law enforcement. The root is still compassion fatigue, but the symptoms and how they display might be different. And then burnout is something that you hear all over the place, but it's really, it's not a fixable thing in the fact that you don't just take vacation. It's not something where if you're burnt out, it's not always the person's problem. I can speak to healthcare, that's where I come from most, but burnout often is a symptom of system failures. And so a lot of the work we do on the burnout side is working with organizations so that they can better address the system failures that are failing the human resources leading to burnout. Now, when we started this Hope to Healing Foundation, and really kind of this goal of healing our healers, which is our tagline, really kind of use some words like, defeated. We use the words like burnt out. And the reality is that's not how people describe themselves. And what I heard back from a lot of folks was just, I'm not fatigued, or I don't have stress, I'm distressed, but I'm not defeated. And so most folks still, they want the resources they want to pursue. They're not giving up on their profession. They're not quitting, but they do need new skills in order to function in today's environment. The top misconception we have is actually about resilience. Being resilient, it seems to, in our current society, have this utopian view of if I'm resilient, I somehow don't suffer. I somehow don't have stress. I somehow don't have upheaval. And that, of course, is not true at all. Resiliency is having those forces against you and still being able to, as you can see by the tree example, still be able to withstand the difficulties. And so it's working through pain, suffering, working through moral distress, working through those challenges. So it's not a matter of avoiding or keeping those things at bay, it's how to cope. Which leads me to the biggest elephant in the room with these professions. And when I say these professions, I'm talking law enforcement. We look at all healthcare workers at every level, looking at veterinarians, teachers, firefighters, anyone who's a community caregiver who's putting themselves out there. What we're finding is we talk about burnout, we talk about system failures, we talk about labor shortages, we talk about just different stressors, but what we don't talk about is professional dissonance, which is what most folks, when they tell us their story, is what they're actually experiencing. And it's where their professional values, or maybe why they went into a profession or a calling, doesn't match the job tasks. And so again, in healthcare, you can read all about it, but you can hear nurses and doctors talking all the time that they went into the profession to heal, to care. And yet they spend the majority of their day documenting, billing, doing administrative tasks that seem misaligned with what their personal reason why they went into the profession, which that's what leads to your distress and ultimately your moral injury. And so really kind of calling out what's going on to really get maybe to that root of the burnout, the fatigue, what's actually causing it. The other part is most folks, even though they're in these professions and have some phenomenal training, self-awareness or understanding of what's going on with their own body. And it's a little striking to me because if I think about my car, I wouldn't drive my car without gas or doing an oil change. And yet we as humans do that to ourselves all day long. So really better being self-aware, helping folks understand what's going on with these activities of caring and what's really going on in your body. And so it's actually a stress response to give compassion. And it's a courage response when you continue to care give. And if you've, of course, ever seen, an emergency situation, you see people tend to be very calm and they're grounded and they prepare for action. That's because they've gone through this process, which is a bit counterintuitive to most resiliency programs that assume that you're not doing this. You're not running into the fire, instead you're running away. And so the resources that we provide are how to actually work with this environment and then what resiliency resources work best. Again, we have at Mayo, we've been doing MRI studies and the neurobiology response to this and really kind of trying to understand the distinction. And there is a difference. There's a difference in how the brain fires. And then the other interesting thing is if you're doing this biological response to caretaking or going into the fire all the time, when you do get fatigued and stressed, unlike other examples where maybe I'll take my husband, he fixes cars for a living. He doesn't have the same brain firing as I do. If he gets fatigued, it still fires a bit. He can still give compassion. It doesn't shut down. If you're doing this constant run into the fire to do compassion and you get fatigued, your brain shuts off. It shuts off that component because it's a safety mechanism. Which if you think about from an organization standpoint, hiring these employees, it's critical that we train people to recognize this and provide the resources because it can be detrimental. It'd be like my car that I didn't do an oil change and now I'm stuck on the side of the road. So we're really looking, how do we help people learn? How do they help them lead? And then how do we build that renewal? We are specifically focused on some really high risk professions. There are other professions that have similarities. One of them is dentists, but they're not at high risk compared to our caregiving professions here that we have listed. So if you know of educators, our clergy and church leaders, anyone in healthcare, law enforcement, veterans, and veterinarians are all in the same boat. of needing these resources, particularly to move into the future and be sustainable for our society. We start pretty simple. We do what we call ABCs, and really it's just a roadmap for what kind of abilities and behaviors do folks need. One of the things we learned, though, was that we are in this really busy time. If you are stressed out, it's very difficult for someone to tell you to become resilient. And even if you know you need some resiliency, it's really hard to know where to start. So part of it is just giving like a manual. It's giving that, and I loved your accountability coach, that the link you shared. That's exactly what we're talking about too. It's someone who just helps coach you, or it's some checklist that helps you just make progress. And then compassion is an interesting thing. So again, I told you that the brain can shut down if you have compassion fatigue. Most programs out there tell you to go take a break, do deep breathing, take a vacation, do something that feels good. And that's good, but it's actually not what refires your brain. So if you are in a profession, or if you're in a caregiving capacity, most of the time, your brain, in order to regain compassion, and we call it compassion satisfaction, once you've been fatigued, is actually give compassion. Now, it doesn't mean beat your head on the brick wall and keep doing the same thing, but I'll take nurses, for example. We often will call upon our nurses to then do other work that extends compassion. So maybe taking them out of their existing job, but in giving them the ability to give compassion, which then refires that brain and then starts building that resiliency much faster. So essentially we do this if we have a lot of online learning at first and a lot of online kind of community building. The other thing that we've learned is folks do need to cope and heal before they can get that renewal of compassion and build resiliency. So a lot of programs jump right into that resiliency, especially since we've had COVID and this perfect storm. We have a lot of folks that just haven't had the chance to cope. If you think of the stages of grief, right, they're still in that denial phase. They might be in the anger phase. They haven't hit the point where they can accept in order to move forward with the resiliency building. And if you go to our website, the one thing I'm super excited about is our current project of Just Tell Your Story. And mostly nurses have actually engaged with us right now in law enforcement. And they want to feel heard. They want to tell their story so that then they can move on. The other aspect we focus on is these restorative practices, and many programs focus on mind and body, but we found very few that incorporated spirit and emotion. And in order to move forward, you need all of that. A human needs all of those aspects. And why emotion? A lot of folks don't even talk about that. Again, if you're in this compassion mode, emotion is part of it. And we don't talk about it much, but we need to. My daughter was in the ICU just a week ago, and I could tell you there's lots of emotions, both for me and the healthcare workers. To not talk about it and not acknowledge it doesn't allow the spirit, mind, or body to do anything if we don't recognize the emotions that are perfectly normal, but we need to bring them to the surface. And then the secret sauce. So the secret sauce is folks like you. It's community. Because without it, I can't get through all of those stages, and I can't keep it. It's not a one-time thing to be resilient. It's something you need to practice and you need to keep up with, and you can't do that without support. And especially in certain professions, if we talk law enforcement, a lot of the programs say, go talk to your loved one or talk to your friends. Well, you don't want to bring that home to them. The only person that can maybe understand is another individual who's experienced what you've experienced. But they're not always easily found. And so how do we build that community? And it's going to take groups like yourselves where you build that community and people can find those resources to help support them with the tools that we provide. In our work, clicked really fast. So in our work, the call to action is simply to empower our community resources. We're working on proactive outreach. We're trying to transform how these resources both think of themselves as well as how organizations view these resources. How do we hear and implement change so that we can have sustained resources over time? But the only way we can do that is really building our community. And so for us, Jessie and I, what we're working on is we have twofold. One, bringing the resources to those in need. The other is funding so that we can continue to build those resources. And the other that's actually not on here is research, continuing that some of the great work like what Mayo's doing, but really getting to what do these resources need. A good example of that research that we're working on now is if you look at burnout and you look at any burnout assessment, I challenge you to find a burnout assessment that actually meets the current environment. Most of them are about 10 to 20 years old. And the top clue to anyone to say, oh, you're burnt out is you don't go to work. But let's face it, we all go to work burnt out. So that's not a good indicator. And so we need better research to better identify, to see these risk factors. Another one you talked about, a lot of these things lead to really bad outcomes often. So if we can address these things, all of these professions have the top suicide rates of any profession globally. It's not even here in the US, it's globally. These are the top professions that we have see suicide, but we're not identifying the triggers or the risk factors to those suicides. And sadly, I see almost an acceptance of, well, it's just part of the risk of having those jobs. And I just don't think that's acceptable. But we need the research to better understand how we can identify and be much more proactive. The other interesting thing is we have this world of robots. I have this longstanding joke that everyone got used to their furry coworkers at home, but now we have to get used to robots in these workplaces. Here I have an example of healthcare, but it doesn't matter. All of these professions are learning to work with new technologies that are not replacing humans, but changing how humans work. And so with healthcare, one of the things we're looking at is the humans, the doctors and the nurses. In the future, we'll spend a lot more time taking care of the humans because that's what they're uniquely qualified to do and what the computer can't do. But we don't train them that way, and we don't build our systems around supporting them. So if I'm now spending more time at the bedside, do I have the support to do that? And so that's where we're really working with the organizations to better prepare, offer more advanced training in these spaces. And of course, schools are something we'd like to target as well, getting these new students who are going to go into these professions. How do we catch them right at the beginning and help to prepare them for what these type of careers can challenge them? So again, compassion is that act of courage and moving towards it. And how do we prepare people for continuing to do that? And so thank you, and I'll stop and I'll let you ask away any questions you have.
All right.